Okay, this is a screencast on my example of a personal review, and I've already done two screencasts on first the roadmap, the writing a review roadmap, and the components of that every good successful review needs to have. And then I also went over APA style and how to set up your paper in a screencast. So today I'm just going to be really focusing on the review itself and the elements that I put in it, and making sure that you have those elements in your screencast. In your essay. And I am going to be using that checklist that is on the roadmap, that starts in number 5. Those questions that you need to use to critically examine your draft to make sure that I have all the elements that I need in order to have a successful review. So, I started off with just a basic introduction. I talked a little bit about how I like to travel, and one of the things that I enjoy the most about traveling is exploring the food culture of the cities and countries that I visit. And I talked about the thing that I love about traveling in the United States. The food that I like to eat the most is clam chowder, and I always like to, when I'm traveling to an ocean-bound state, I always like to, or near the coast, I always like to try clam chowder where I go, and I've tried it all the way up the East Coast, and then this summer I was able to try it all the way down the West Coast. So I started out my description or my review with what is clam chowder, and I use Webster's Dictionary, and I know that I told you, since these are personal reviews, you don't want to use any outside information. However, a dictionary definition is one of those kinds of things that is always okay to use, because a dictionary definition is not something that can be it's not in any kind of bias. It's a dictionary term. So we widely accept a dictionary definition as is kind of common knowledge, I guess. Maybe it's a stretch, but we accept that as an established fact. So I use a dictionary definition to define what chowder is, because I felt like that was probably the most important thing about to establish for my review is what is chowder. Because a lot of people, if you told them, I love to eat clam chowder, they wouldn't know what chowder is. Okay, so I started my and you notice that I put in a bold heading for that, and I'm just establishing what clam chowder is. I established what chowder is, and then I'm very specific into talking about what clam chowder is, because it is the most well-known of all types of chowder. There's all different kinds. You can do potato chowder and corn chowder and chicken chowder, all kinds of things. But I gave you the definition of chowder, and then I gave the definition, or the parameters, I guess, for what clam chowder is and what's usually in clam chowder. And then I talk a little bit about the origin of clam chowder and how it in New England is kind of where it started. And then I talked about that's kind of widely accepted as the origin in the United States of this dish. But then I went on to say that other areas in the United States all put their own spin on what the chowder is. And then I go even further into that and talk about the different types of the recipe, and specifically how the broth is made different. So some restaurants use clam juice to make thinner, clear broth, and then some use milk and flour to make a white base that is thick and creamy, and then some even take tomatoes and spices and make a red broth, and that's just a restaurant's choice. But I felt like that was all necessary information to set up the parameters for what clam chowder is. Then you notice that my next heading is what makes a good clam chowder. This is my opinion, my personal preference for what I like to see in a clam chowder. So you are going to want to establish that as well. You're not an expert. You're a college student, and you are, if you're reviewing a book or a movie or a television show or a car or anything like that, you're not a hard and fast expert. So it's important for you to denote that it's a personal preference. This review is based off of my personal preference. Okay, and I talk about what I like to see in a good clam chowder. I talk about the type of broth that I like. I talk about the clams. They have to be fresh. I won't eat this dish away from the coast. Eating it inland is just asking for it to me for seafood. You eat seafood at the beach. And I talk about that. I talked about how I prefer to eat my chowder. If I like it in a bowl and cut with crackers. But if the bread is fresh and they're making like bread bowls fresh in house at the restaurant, I will order it in a bread bowl, but that's not necessary. And then I also said that I like flavorful chowder that doesn't require any additional seasoning, but I will often add Tabasco hot sauce to kick it up a notch. Those are my personal parameters for what I consider to be a good clam chowder. This isn't the United States standard. Everybody is different, but these are my particular criteria for evaluation that I use to establish whether or not I believe a clam chowder is good or bad. Okay, then I go on to set up my experiment. I talk about the clam chowder that I've had across the coast, and I said that my favorites are usually in New England states, but that for purposes of this review, I never pass up an opportunity to taste this in coastal towns whenever I come across it because I'm trying to find the best. And then I set up my experiment. This past summer, my son and I took a road trip along the Pacific Coast Highway. We flew into Seattle, rented a car, drove 1,200 miles down the coast to San Francisco, and I ate 10 bowls of clam chowder along my journey for comparison purposes. And then I set it up. I set the entire experiment up. Here are my picks for the best clam chowder by West Coast state. Okay, I didn't say here are the best restaurants, here are this. These are my picks. These are the chowder, out of the chowders, the 10 that I ate, the 3 best by state. So I'm going to have one from Washington, I'm going to have one from Oregon, and I'm going to have one from California. Okay, and so I decided to set my review up with a picture and a little bit of background information about the restaurant or the area that it's in before I kind of talk about my thing. And so you notice that in my header, I gave the restaurant, I gave the address, and then I included a picture of the clam chowder. And these are my personal pictures that I added into my review. Now, do you need to use a picture? You don't have to. It's not necessary. Only when any media that you're adding, film clips, music clips, if you're reviewing a piece of music, if you're reviewing a piece of art, do you really need to add that as additional information for your reader? I'm willing to bet that a lot of you have never seen what clam chowder looks like because you probably never thought to eat it because you hear the word clam and you get turned off by it, but I didn't know if people had ever seen a bowl of clam chowder before, and so that adds a little bit extra to my my review. And so I start off that restaurant by talking about where it's located. I said that it's a busy spot in Seattle's Pike Place Market, and I do this because, number one, I'm assuming that maybe if my reader is ever in that part of the country and they're looking for a place to eat, they may check this place out. So that's why you give that extra information to get your reader engaged. So I talk a little bit about where it's located, and it is the Yelp in 2018 named Pike Place Chowder the #1 chowder in America. And so the line was down the block and around the corner and down the next block. And so my son was frustrated because we were waiting in line, but by God, I was going to try this chowder because we were there. Okay, so we waited 45 minutes to get to eat. I talk about the recipe that I order on the menu, and then I launch into my description of the chowder. And I'm using that criteria that I established up here in my what makes a good clam chowder as basis for my review. I talk about the way it's presented. I talk about the type of broth. I talk about the way that it is set up and how it's seasoned. I am using that criteria that I developed for my review in that particular one. And then I say what I would rate it as and how, and if you should try that I suggested or not suggested. And that's just a good way to set that up. I do that 2 more times. I talk about the Hungry Clam in Brookings, Oregon. Do the same thing. I talk about how we had crossed over to tour all the Goonie sites in Astoria, Oregon. And then I talk about the restaurant just a little bit. I'm very honest. I say, to be honest, even though I was impressed with Oregon's beaches and scenery, out of all the places that we traveled, the seafood scene was really not the draw for me. We did happen to have the home of the original corn dog. It was originally called a Pronto Pup at Rockaway Beach, and I talk about that, but it wasn't the seafood specifically that I was going to Oregon for. So I talk about how that's why the chowder itself was not 100% like exactly what I'd gone to kind of eat, but that when I did, this was the best of the ones that I tried in Oregon. I do the same thing. I talk about how it's set up, talk about the broth, I talk about how it's presented, I talk about the clams and whatever, and then I continue on to finish out that review and what if I would refer it to somebody else. Same thing with Pier Place Market in San Francisco. I set it up. I talk a little bit. It's right by Alcatraz, the boats for Alcatraz Island, which is why we were there in the first place. And I talk about why I ordered and what I ordered, and then I set it up again with those criteria and whether I would recommend it or not. And then I need a conclusion. I got to tie everything together. So you've read all of these things about the different types of chowder that I tried. And then I need to conclude that in some way. I need to kind of close out that particular, my review, and to tell my reader that, I'm still looking for perfect clam chowder. I'm going to Alaska next year. I'm going to try all their chowder too. People might think that's weird, but I mean, it's just my thing. It's what I like to do. So I talk about that, and then I end with a concluding sentence that just ties my paper together. One day I'm sure I'll come across the chowder to beat all chowders, and my quest will be complete. Okay, so I went through that road map list of all those things, and it checks off every single box. I provide clear transitions. You know exactly what you're looking at when you're looking at it, and I'm doing that with those bold headings. I have a good balance of background information and evaluation. There's not more description than there is evaluating when I'm actually evaluating the product that I'm writing about. I use reasons and evidence. I establish clear criteria. I conclude well. I introduce well. So you need to think about these things when you're writing your own review.